In Act 1, we watched Leibniz set the trap. Gravity is either absurd or unexplained. In Act 2, we climbed into the tower and found what Newton actually believed, that God's omnipresence in space is the medium of gravity. In Act 3, we watched Whiston tear part of that veil in public and asked whether Leibniz, one of the best connected minds in Europe, would have noticed. Now the correspondence begins. And what unfolds over the next year, 5 letters from Leibniz, 5 replies from Clarke, between November 1715 and October 1716, is not a polite academic exchange. It is a theological interrogation conducted in the language of natural philosophy. To understand what's really happening, you have to see that this isn't just two men arguing about space and time and gravity. It's two gods in collision. November 1715, Leibniz writes to Caroline, Princess of Wales. The letter is short. It is devastating. He opens with a broadside. Natural religion seems to be greatly on the decline in England. That's not a throwaway. It's an accusation. Leibniz is telling a princess of the British court that Newton's philosophy is corroding faith. Then he zeroes in. 2 charges. First, Newton says that space is an organ, a sensorium, by which God perceives things. But if God needs an organ to perceive things, Leibniz says, then things don't depend entirely on God. The Creator needs a prosthetic to see his own creation. Second, and this is the one that echoes down the centuries, he accuses Newton of making God into a bad clockmaker. God's watch, the universe, would stop working if he didn't rewind it from time to time. He didn't have enough foresight to give it perpetual motion. This machine that he has made is so imperfect that from time to time he has to clean it by a miraculous intervention and even has to mend it, as a clockmaker mends his work. And then the knife. The oftener a clockmaker has to adjust his machine and set it right, the clumsier he must be as a clockmaker. This is a brilliant piece of philosophical rhetoric. In 2 paragraphs, Leibniz has framed the entire debate. Newton's God is a tinkerer, a mechanic who didn't get it right the first time, an artisan who has to keep reaching into his creation to fix what he botched. Against this, Leibniz offers his own God, the God of pre-established harmony. A God who in one supreme act of infinite wisdom designed a universe so perfect that it never needs correction. Every event, every interaction, every apparent cause and effect, all of it was synchronized at the moment of creation, like an infinitely complex piece of clockwork that runs forever without the maker's hand. 2 gods, 2 theologies, 2 completely different pictures of how the divine relates to the natural, and the physics of gravity sits right at the fault line between them. Clarke's reply arrives within weeks. And here we need to understand who Clarke is and what position he's defending. Samuel Clarke is not just any Newtonian. He is Newton's chosen theological spokesman, the man Newton trusts to handle the public argument. Clarke has access to Newton during the correspondence. Scholars generally agree that Newton reviewed and shaped Clarke's replies. But Clarke is also, as we saw in Act 3, a man under his own theological suspicion. His 1712 scripture doctrine of the Trinity had been examined by the bishops. He was skating near Arian territory himself, so Clarke is defending Newton while being personally vulnerable on exactly the theological point Leibniz is probing. His reply to the clockmaker charge is theologically sharp. The idea that the world is a great machine that goes on without intervention by God, like a clock ticking along without help from a clockmaker, that's the idea of materialism and fate. Clarke flips Leibniz's attack. It's not Newton who diminishes God, it's Leibniz. A God who sets up the universe and walks away is a God who has been excluded from his own creation. A king who never governs is a king in name only. Clarke insists, God is not an absentee landlord. He is continuously active, continuously present, continuously sustaining. The universe depends on God at every moment, not because God botched the design, but because that's what it means for God to be God. This is a genuinely powerful theological move. and it's also the move that exposes Newton's flank. Because if God is continuously, actively sustaining the universe at every point, if he is omnipresent, not just virtually, but substantially, then the question becomes, what exactly is God doing at every point in space? And if the answer involves anything like ordering the motions of bodies according to a mathematical law, you're very close to saying God is the cause of gravity. To understand the next phase of the debate, we need the exact passage that started the trouble. In Query 28 of the Optics, Newton wrote, "Does it not appear from phenomena that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent, who in infinite space, as it were in his sensory, sees the things themselves intimately, and throughly perceives them, and comprehends them wholly by their immediate presence to himself?" Now, Newton was careful. He wrote, as it were, specifically the Latin word tanquam, signaling analogy, not identity. Space is like God's sensorium, not literally identical to it. The analogy works like this. In a human being, the mind perceives images formed in the brain, the sensorium, by the sense organs. God, being omnipresent, perceives things directly, by being immediately present to them everywhere in space. So space functions for God the way the sensorium functions for the human mind, as the place of perception. Clarke defends this carefully. Newton doesn't say that space is the organ God uses to perceive things by. His view is that because God is omnipresent, he perceives all things just by being immediately present to them. And Newton regards the brain and sense organs as the means by which those pictures are formed, not as the means by which the mind perceives those pictures once they have been formed. In other words, sense organs create images. The mind perceives them by being present to them. God doesn't need organs because he is present to the things themselves. Space is the place of that presence. It's subtle, it's defensible, but Leibniz sees the trap inside it. Over the next 4 exchanges, Leibniz keeps returning to the sensorium, and each time he tightens the screw. In his second paper, in the appendix to his Optics, I find Newton saying explicitly that space is the sensorium of God, and sensorium has always signified the organ of sensation. He's not buying the, as it were, dodge. A sensorium is an organ. If space is God's sensorium, then God has an organ. If God has an organ, God has a body, or at least God's relationship to space looks disturbingly like a soul's relationship to a body. By the 4th paper, Leibniz has escalated. There is hardly any expression less proper upon this subject than that which makes God to have a sensorium. It seems to make God the soul of the world. And again, God perceives things in himself. Space is the place of things, not the place of God's ideas. Unless we look upon space as something that makes a union between God and things, in imitation of the imagined union between the soul and the body, which would still make God the soul of the world. This is the charge Newton feared most. Soul of the world, anima mundi, is code for pantheism, or at least for a God so entangled with creation that the distinction between creator and creature collapses. Why was this to be avoided? Anima mundi was politically dangerous. If God is the soul of the world, then the world is divine. If the world is divine, the king isn't special, the church isn't special, and you're 5 minutes away from breaking down the dominant political structure of Western Europe. Leibniz was framing Newton's masterpiece as radicalism. It was precisely the accusation that would follow from Newton's actual private theology. God substantially present in space, space as an emanative effect of God's existence, God's omnipresence as the medium through which natural forces operate. In his 5th paper, Leibniz drives the point home. Besides, this is exactly falling into the view that God is the soul of the world. It says that God senses things not through their dependence upon him, but through a kind of feeling like the one through which some people think that our soul senses what happens in the body. Notice what Leibniz is doing. He's not just making a semantic complaint about the word sensorium. He's exposing a structural problem. If God perceives things by being present to them in space, rather than by producing them through his creative power, then God stands in the same relation to the world that a soul stands in to a body. God becomes part of the world, not its transcendent author. For Leibniz, this is the worst possible theology. His God is pure intellect, pure will, operating through pre-established harmony from outside the system. Newton's God, present at every point, continuously active, perceiving things by proximity, is something much more intimate, much more inside the world, and much more dangerous to admit publicly. But Leibniz doesn't stop at the sensorium. He opens a second front, gravity itself. In his fourth paper, section 45, "'Tis also a supernatural thing that bodies should attract one another at a distance, without any intermediate means, and that a body should move round without receding in the tangent, though nothing hinder it from so receding, for these effects cannot be explained by the nature of things." Mechanistic philosophy was the gold standard of the age. Bodies must touch to influence. Even Newton admitted in semi-private letters that gravity acting through a vacuum was an absurdity, yet his equations demanded it. Newton was being quite truthful in his upholding the mechanistic necessity of contact. However, the public didn't know what only a select few knew. What you and I know today. Through the loaded word supernatural, Leibniz is aiming for the throat. If gravity isn't explained by the shape, size, or contact of matter, it's beyond nature. And anything beyond nature that happens every single second is, by definition, a perpetual miracle. For Leibniz, Newton hadn't discovered the laws of the universe. He'd just admitted that the universe was broken and God was constantly fixing it. Clarke responds, and his response is revealing. One body should attract another without any intermediate means, is indeed not a miracle, but a contradiction. For 'tis supposing something to act where it is not. But the means by which two bodies attract each other may be invisible and intangible, and of a different nature from mechanism, and yet acting regularly and constantly may well be called natural. Read that carefully. Clarke is conceding that bare action at a distance, body pulling on body through absolute void, is not just wrong but contradictory. He agrees with Leibniz on this. There must be some means. But then he says, those means might be invisible and intangible and of a different nature from mechanism. Something that is invisible, intangible, non-mechanical, and yet acts regularly and constantly throughout all of space. What could that possibly be? If you've been following Acts 1 through 3, you know the answer Newton has locked in his chest. God's continuous, omnipresent, voluntary ordering of bodies according to mathematical law. Clarke is describing, without naming it, the divine activity that Newton privately believed was the cause of gravity. And Leibniz knows it. In his fifth paper, he pounces, if the means which causes an attraction properly so called be constant and at the same time inexplicable by the powers of creatures and yet be true, it must be a perpetual miracle. And if it is not miraculous, it is false. 'Tis a chimerical thing, a scholastic occult quality. This is the dilemma reloaded, the same trap from Act 1, but now with theological stakes made explicit. If gravity operates through means that are non-mechanical and beyond the power of creatures to produce, it is a perpetual miracle, and you've smuggled theology into physics. If it's not a miracle, then it's not real. It's a fiction dressed up with equations. Either way, Newtonian gravity is in trouble. And then the devastating follow-up. It cannot be regular without being reasonable, nor natural, unless it can be explained by the natures of creatures. Translation: calling something natural doesn't make it natural. If you can't explain it through the properties of created things, then God is doing it directly. And that's a miracle, no matter how often it happens. Now step back and see the full shape of what Leibniz is doing across 5 letters. He has constructed a pincer movement. From the theological side, the sensorium attack. 1. Newton's God is too intimate with creation. 2. Space as God's sensorium makes God the soul of the world. 3. This is pantheism, or something dangerously close to it. 4. Clarke keeps insisting God is present in space, not as a soul, but as a governor. But Leibniz keeps showing that the structure of the relationship looks exactly like soul to body. From the physical side, the gravity attack. 5. Gravity requires a cause. 6. That cause is either mechanical, then specify it, or non-mechanical. 7. If non-mechanical, it's either miraculous, theology masquerading as physics, or unintelligible, occult quality. 8. Clarke admits the cause is non-mechanical, but natural, which Leibniz shows is incoherent. The two fronts converge. If God is omnipresent in space, sensorium, and gravity operates through some non-mechanical, invisible, intangible means, Clarke's admission, then the obvious conclusion is that God's omnipresence is the means by which gravity operates. But saying that out loud would not only confirm Leibniz's charge that God is the soul of the world, but also reveal the theological engine behind Newton's physics that exposes the anti-Trinitarian theology, making God's omnipresent substance the medium of natural forces. Leibniz is not trying to get Clarke to say this. He's trying to demonstrate that Clarke can't say it, and that the silence is telling. Follow how Clarke navigates, or fails to navigate, this squeeze. On the sensorium, he keeps insisting the analogy is limited, that God perceives by being present, but isn't therefore the soul of the world. But he cannot explain how mere presence enables perception without making presence functionally identical to the soul-body relationship. Clarke says, a soul is part of a compound, the other part being a body, and they affect each other as parts of the same whole. But God is present to the world not as a part, but as a governor. Leibniz replies, fine, but your account of how God governs through presence looks exactly like the soul-body relation you're trying to deny. On gravity, Clarke admits there must be a means, not bare action at distance. He admits that means is non-mechanical, yet calls it natural because it's regular. However, he cannot specify what it is because specifying it would mean saying God's omnipresent will operating through his substantial presence in space. On the clockmaker charge, Clarke insists God's continuous intervention is a glory, not a defect which plays directly into Leibniz's hands. If God must continuously intervene, then the universe is not self-sufficient, and every regular natural process is really a divine act, that is, a perpetual miracle. At every turn, Clarke is caught between saying too much, revealing the theological core, saying too little, appearing to have no answer, and saying the wrong thing, making Newton's God look like the soul of the world. His default move, Hypotheses non-Fingo repackaged as the means of gravity may be non-mechanical but natural, is exactly the kind of evasion that tells Leibniz everything he needs to know. By August 1716, 5 exchanges deep, Leibniz has established 1. Newton's God is substantially omnipresent in space. Clarke has defended this explicitly, quoting the General Scholium. God endures always and is present everywhere, and by existing always and everywhere constitutes duration and space. 2. Gravity requires a non-mechanical cause. Clarke has admitted this. Something invisible and intangible, and of a different nature from mechanism. 3. Clarke cannot name that cause. Every time Leibniz presses, Clarke retreats to the phenomenon of gravity is an inductively established fact, which is hypotheses non-Fingo in English dress. 4. The sensorium analogy reveals the architecture. If space is God's place of perception and God acts through his presence in space, then God is the hidden cause of everything that happens in space, including gravity. 5. The theological position is heterodox, making God the substance of space, making divine will the cause of regular natural phenomena, collapsing the distinction between God and creation. This is not standard Anglican orthodoxy. It is closer to Stoic pantheism, to Henry More's Cambridge Platonism, to the very positions Newton's Arian theology would entail. Thus Leibniz has, across 5 letters, assembled a complete diagnostic of what Newton believes and why he won't say it. And in that 5th letter, August 1716, he writes a single phrase that condenses the entire case into 7 words, a phrase that tells Newton, through Clarke, "I see exactly what you're hiding." But that phrase belongs to Act 5. Act 4 ends with the correspondence at full boil and the architecture of Leibniz's attack fully revealed. He has conducted a systematic theological cross-examination in the form of a philosophical debate. Every question about space, time, the sensorium, miracles, occult qualities, and the cause of gravity has been aimed at the same target. Force Newton's camp to either name the cause of gravity and expose the theology, or refuse to name it and admit that Newtonian physics rests on an answer they dare not speak. Clarke, defending an indefensible position with real skill, has managed to avoid the worst admissions. But the evasions themselves are evidence. Invisible and intangible, and of a different nature from mechanism, is not an explanation. It is a description of what you'd say if you knew the answer was God, but couldn't put it in print. 3 months after writing his 5th letter, Leibniz will be dead. But before he dies, he leaves behind a single phrase, 7 words, carefully chosen, that shows he understood the secret Newton had spent a lifetime concealing. In Act 5, we'll read those words, and everything will fall into place.